The Bg Chckd Clth. The boy had grown so giddy that it was a long while before he came to himself. The winds howled and beat against him, and the rustle of feathers and swaying of wings sounded like a whole storm. 13 geese flew around him, flapping their wings and honking. They danced before his eyes and they buzzed in his ears. He didn't know whether they flew high or low, or in what direction they were traveling. After a bit, he regained just enough sense to understand that he ought to find out where the geese were taking him. But this was not so easy, for he didn't know how he should ever muster up courage enough to look down. He was sure he'd faint if he attempted it. The wild geese were not flying very high because the new traveling companion could not breathe in the very thinnest air. For his sake, they also flew a little slower than usual. At last the boy just made himself cast one glance down to earth. Then he thought that a great big rug lay spread beneath him, which was made up of an incredible number of large and small checks. Where in all the world am I now? He wondered. He saw nothing but check upon check. Some were broad and ran crosswise. Some were long and narrow all over. There were angles and corners. Nothing was round, and nothing was crooked. "What kind of big checked cloth is this that I'm looking down on?" said the boy to himself, without expecting anyone to answer him. But instantly the wild geese who flew about him called out, "Fields and meadows! Fields and meadows!" Then he understood that the big checked cloth he was traveling over was the flat land of southern Sweden, and he began to comprehend why it looked so checked and multicolored. The bright green checks he recognized first. They were rye fields that had been sown in the fall and had kept themselves green under the winter snow. The yellow-gray checks were stubble fields, the remains of the oat crops which had grown there the summer before. The brownish ones were old clover meadows, and the black ones deserted grazing lands or plowed up fallow pastures. The brown checks with the yellow edges were undoubtedly beech tree forests, for in these you'd find the big trees which grow in the heart of the forest, naked in the winter, while the little beech trees, which grow along the borders, keep their dry yellowed leaves way into the spring. There were also dark checks with gray centers. These were the large built-up estates encircled by the small cottages with their blackening straw roofs and their stone-divided land plots. And then there were checks green in the middle with brown borders. These were orchards, where the grass carpets were already turning green, although the trees and bushes around them were still in their nude brown bark. The boy could not keep from laughing when he saw how checked everything looked. But when the geese heard him laugh, they called out, kind of reprovingly, "Fertile and good land, fertile and good land." The boy had already become serious. "To think that you can laugh, you who have met the most terrible misfortune that can possibly happen to a human being," thought he. And for a moment he was pretty serious, but it wasn't long before he was laughing again. Now that he had grown somewhat accustomed to the ride and the speed, so that he could think of something beside holding himself on the gander's back, he began to notice how full the air was of birds flying northward, and there was a shouting and a calling from flock to flock. "So you came over today?" shrieked some. "Yes," answered the geese. "How do you think spring's getting on?" "Not a leaf on the trees and ice-cold water in the lakes," came back the answer. When the geese flew over a place they saw any tame, half-naked fowl, they shouted, "What's the name of this place? What's the name of this place?" Then the roosters cocked their heads and answered, "It's named Lilgard this year, the same as last year." Most of the cottages were probably named after their owners, which is the custom in Skane. But instead of saying, "This is Per Matsson's" or "Ola Boltson's," the rooster hit upon the kind of name which, to their way of thinking, was more appropriate. Those who lived on small farms and belonging to poor cottages cried, "This place is called Grain Scarce," and those who belonged to the poorest hut dwellers screamed, "The name of this place is Little to Eat, Little to Eat, Little to Eat." The big, well-cared-for farms got high-sounding names from the roosters, such as Lucky Meadows and Eggburgia and Moneyville. But the roosters on the great land estates were too high and mighty to condescend to anything like jesting. One of them crowed and called out with such gusto that it sounded like he wanted to be heard clear up to the sun. "This is Herr Derrick's estate, the same this year as last year, this year as last year." A little further on strutted one rooster who crowed, "This is Swanholme. Surely all the world knows that." The boy observed that the geese did not fly straight forward, but zigzagged hither and thither over the whole south country, just as though they were glad to be in Skane again and wanted to pay their respects to every separate place. They came to one place where there were a number of big, clumsy-looking buildings with great tall chimneys, and all around these were a lot of smaller houses. "This is Wndrfl sugar refinery," cried the roosters. The boy shuddered as he sat there on the goose's back. He ought to have recognized this place, for it was not very far from his home. Here he had worked the year before as a watch boy, but to be sure, nothing was exactly like itself when one saw it like that from up above. Just think! Just think! Also the goose girl and little Mats, who were his comrades last year. Indeed, the boy would have been glad to know if they were still anywhere about here. Fancy that they would have said had they suspected that he was flying over their heads. Soon Wndrfl was lost to sight, and they travelled toward Skeldal and Skabber Lake, and back again over Bg Clth and Hackenbergia. The boy saw more of Skane in this one day than he had ever seen before in all the years that he had lived. Whenever the wild geese happened to fly across any tame geese, they had the best fun. They flew forward very slowly and called down, "We're off to the hills. Are you coming along? Are you coming along?" But the tame geese answered, "It's still winter in this country. You're out too soon. Fly back, fly back." The wild geese lowered themselves that they might be heard a little better and called, "Come along, we'll teach you how to fly and swim." Then the tame geese got mad and wouldn't answer them back with a single honk. The wild geese sank themselves still lower until they almost touched the ground. Then, quick as lightning, they raised themselves, just as if they'd been terribly frightened. "Oh, oh, oh!" they exclaimed. "Those things were not geese. They were only sheep. They were only sheep." The ones on the ground were beside themselves with rage and shrieked, "May you be shot! The whole lot of you! The whole lot of you!" When the boy heard all this teasing, he laughed. Then he remembered how badly things had gone with him, and he cried. But the next second he was laughing again. Never before had he ridden so fast, and to ride fast and recklessly, that he had always liked. And, of course, he had never dreamed that it could be as fresh and bracing as it was up in the air, or that there rose from the earth such a fine scent of resin and soil. Nor had he ever dreamed what it could be like to ride so high above the earth. It was just like flying away from the sorrow and trouble and annoyances of every kind that could be thought of.